So yeah, thanks everyone for showing up. Before I really launch into this, I want to note that this is an outcoming of the Mars Science Laboratory Curiosity rover team, particularly the Chemin team and others, of course, that participate in the team. And then there's a very long 39 author list, and so every one of these people contributed to this. And I know that some of you are on the call, so thanks for coming. Okay, so CO2 obviously is an important greenhouse gas for planetary habitability. We know that all too well here on Earth, that as CO2 increases in a planet's atmosphere, you can increase the greenhouse warming effect such that more of the sun's light gets trapped in or on the surface of the planet, and then more heat is there, and the temperature increases. So this plot here from a number of years ago is a whole bunch of simulations of exoplanet atmospheres. And what you can see is that on the y-axis is the partial pressure of CO2 in the planet's atmosphere. On the x-axis is the incident flux of solar radiation, of course, one here being Earth. And then way out here being the planet that we're going to be talking about mostly today, Mars. And what this collection of simulations shows you is that Mars is currently outside of the known habitable zone because its partial pressure of CO2 is too low to have liquid water above 273 Kelvin. So that's the red line here. Basically, we need to be above there to get there. And so what this indicates is that if Mars did, and there's plenty of evidence for it, did have liquid water on its ancient surface, the partial pressure of CO2 must have been much higher. So we do have abundant evidence for this, and I've just collected some of that here on this slide. So Mars used to be warm and wet, and this appears to have required a CO2-rich atmosphere. So largely, unlike Earth, Mars's atmosphere is thought to have been primarily always comprised predominantly of CO2. So on this plot here from Edwin Kite's review paper from 2019, you can see atmospheric pressure here and then some geological evidence that puts constraints on the atmospheric pressure on ancient Mars. And in all cases, you can see that the atmospheric pressure seems to have been needed to have been, above on the order of a tenth of a bar or so before a billion years ago. In the middle plot is a plot from Robin Wordsworth's 2021 paper thinking about the collision-induced absorption effect, CIA, and its potential for warming early Mars. And here, what they show is that even at the minimum of about 1 bar of CO2, partial pressure at 3.5 billion years ago, you probably would have likely only had several, maybe even like about a 500,000 year or less of habitable conditions, time warm, so time above 0 degrees Celsius, early in the planet's habitability. So largely what this suggests is that we need, based on our current understanding of atmospheric CO2 and its behavior in the Martian atmosphere and the behavior of our sun over the solar system history, you need abundant CO2 in the atmosphere in order to warm early Mars and make all of these features that we know and love indicate liquid water. So the clay minerals that we see, sulfates and evaporites, manganese oxides, as well as the geomorphological features of valley networks and craters degradation. So again, that's plotted here on the right-hand side. So the modern atmosphere is about 6 millibars of CO2. And then if you look above this high altitude water ice cloud, maybe 0.5 bar or so of CO2 is required. And collision-induced absorption suggests about 1 bar or so of CO2 is required just to get you above zero. And so where is all of that CO2? So here is a plot from Joukowsky's paper from 2019 showing essentially the pathways or the known or hypothesized pathways for CO2 over the history of Mars. So you can see the idea is that volcanoes would have outgassed on the order of 2,000 to 3,000 millibars or 2,000 or 2 to 3 bars of CO2 early in the planet's history or throughout its history. But the current atmosphere, of course, only contains 6 millibars, meaning that a lot has been lost to other places. So impacts probably removed on the order of 0.5 or 1 bar of CO2 to space. Some of it got stripped off from the upper atmosphere on the order of 1 to 1.5 bars. And then there's all of these geologic processes that folks like me like to think about. So shallow carbonate formation, this is carbonates precipitating in the shallow subsurface of the planet. Deep carbonates, this is hypothesized to exist in the deeper parts of the basaltic subsurface. And then these other ones, absorb gas, clathrates, and polarize. I think the big thing here is that there's a large question mark on this carbonate. So how much carbonate has actually been formed and how much of that actually can account for the initial CO2 endowment of Mars. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. That's the missing carbonate, carbon. Okay, and importantly, our study isn't the first study to identify carbonates on Mars. So carbonates have been identified before, but often only semi-quantitatively. So what I mean by that is that they don't typically have the capabilities of an X-ray diffraction instrument like we do on the Curiosity rover in order to identify the abundance of the carbonates. So, for example, this paper from Bethany Edelman was able to estimate, at least using spectroscopic data, how much carbonate is there, but it's not necessarily quantitative. It's semi-quantitative at best. And then on the right-hand side, we see that there's evidence from Martian meteorites where we have considerable evidence of carbonates forming in those rocks, but we rarely know where those rocks came from. And again, we rarely know the geological context of their formation. So on the left-hand side is a compilation of all of the carbonates that have been seen in Martian rocks to date, and there's lots of examples. And the one thing that you will take away from this as we go on is that most of these carbonates are fairly rich in magnesium, so going towards the magnesite projection on the ternary, and fairly rich in calcium going towards the calcite projection on the ternary. Very few of them are pure iron carbonate. Okay. Mount Sharp is an ideal location for exploring the history of habitability on Mars because Mount Sharp is here. It's this green star, and it happens to occur right at and this is Gale crater, right at the boundary between the northern and southern hemispheres of the planet, so right at the equator. And it also is a place that holds the largest or thickest stack of sediments anywhere observed on the planet. So while there are lots of evidence for lakes on ancient Mars, Curiosity happens to have chosen perhaps one of the best ones because this sedimentary stack records lots of geological transitions from the planet's past. And this is a photo taken from very early on in the mission of Mount Sharp. So here's Gale crater. Mount Sharp is in the center of the crater. And the goal for the mission has been to slowly climb this Mount Sharp, the stack of sediments known as Mount Sharp, and get at the geological and habitability record that has been recorded in this stack of sediments. And so you can see we started down here in the flattest, most safest part to land of the crater, and we've slowly been climbing up and eventually got to this clay-bearing unit, which was a long-term goal of the mission, but then more recently, the magnesium sulfate-bearing unit. And importantly, and this will become clearer as we go on, this transition between the clay-bearing unit and the magnesium sulfate-bearing unit is something that we have mapped around the planet on Mars and is thought to represent the terminal drying of Mars. So importantly, Curiosity is an ideal machine for exploring the history of Martian habitability. There are lots of instruments on this rover, and I don't have time to get into all of them today. But the ones that we will mention, at least in some detail today, is Mastcam. So all of the beautiful photographic mosaics that I am presenting today came from the Mastcam instrument. ChemCam instrument, which is a wonderful tool for doing reconnaissance geochemistry along the rover's traverse using laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. The Chemin instrument, which is again the main feature of the talk today, that does mineralogy on Mars. And then finally, the SAM or sample analysis at Mars instrument will be briefly mentioned. And what it does is enables us to get better understanding of the chemistry, but then also the isotopic composition of materials. Okay, so the Chemin instrument shown here is a transmission geometry X-ray diffraction instrument. What we do is drill samples from the surface of Mars, put them into the belly of the rover. They get analyzed via this X-ray diffraction instrument where a X-ray beam is shot through the sample and the diffraction that occurs as those X-rays pass through minerals in the sample is corresponding to the characteristic spacing of atoms in the sample, which allows us to tell their mineralogy. Using advanced processing techniques, including Rietveld refinement, we can then get at the quantitative composition of the samples in terms of their mineralogy. So again, thinking about the rover traverse, we started down here in the base of the crater and have slowly climbed up to where we are today. This screenshot was just taken earlier today. And the most interesting things that we are going to focus on today occurred along this section of the traverse, particularly along this magnesium sulfate bearing unit. So the magnesium sulfate bearing unit was mapped from space, including by, I believe, some PSI affiliated scientists prior to our landing in the crater. And the concept here is that magnesium sulfate salts such as starkite, kieserite, and epsomite potentially, and perhaps even meridianite, all would have formed in extremely dry environments, places where you have really low amounts of water around. That we know that because to make these salts, you have to, or because these salts are so incredibly soluble, to make them, you have to evaporate the solutions very dramatically. And so the place where we start identifying these using the Chemin instrument is the Canaima drill site here, which occurs right here in the top of the contiguous member, and again with the boundary of the Catramani member. So this was such an important day for the mission that it went out as a news release on the Curiosity News webpage. So Curiosity Mars rover reaches long-awaited salty region. So the Canaima sample was obtained from lacustrine sediments, so sediments that look like they were deposited by a lake, here at the Canaima drill site. And so this is the paper put out by Steve Chipra in JGR Planets. So Chemin identified starkite, so magnesium sulfate with 4 waters, and marked the formal start of the sulfate-bearing unit, which again, shown on the left side here, was mapped by space. These green areas here are indications of these sulfate minerals, whereas down below we ended up with iron oxides and clay minerals. So this drill site, importantly, was the first place anywhere on Mars where people had definitively identified the presence of a magnesium sulfate mineral, in this case, starkite. And then also, it'll be important later to talk about this, it also contains the minerals hematite and goethite, so iron oxyhydroxides, minerals that contain iron in its oxidized state. And that'll be important contrast with the siderite that we observed higher up. So 4.7% hematite, 2.2% goethite, and 0% siderite. So going up further section, one of the other outstanding places that had been mapped by space in Gale crater is this Amapari marker band, abbreviated here as the Amapari member. So this is a bench that occurs throughout the crater, so an extremely large geographic feature, obviously can be mapped from space. Clearly a significant event in ancient Mars history. And here's a photo of it from on the ground in Gale crater. We were able to cross this 2 times. So here's the first crossing over here. You can see the rover tracks there, second crossing over here. And when we were there, we tried to drill it with Curiosity's drill 3 separate times, and none of those, unfortunately, could penetrate the marker band. So the important observation about the marker band, other than its interest in terms of its morphological features, is that it's very hard, and so perhaps impermeable to fluids that might have been circulating during later diagenesis. So nonetheless, we were able to, as a team, get some information about these formations that form the marker band. And one important conclusion that these wave ripples, you can see the ripple crests here in these photographs from Gale crater, formed in ancient ice-free lakes. So this must have been waves washing in and out on an ancient shoreline, meaning, of course, that at this time there was liquid water on Mars. So going up right above the marker band, so again, we tried to drill the marker band several times with no success. We then drilled the Topo Caparo sample. And the Topo Caparo sample was acquired from this site here, and you can see it looks like it was in a fairly deep lake at this point based on the sedimentary features here. And it was drilled just above the marker band, so perhaps in a transition away from those wave rippled into a deeper lake strata. And what we discovered here was a surprise to basically all of us on the mission. The Topo Caparo sample is the most carbonate-rich sample analyzed on Mars to date. It's outlined here, so its mineralogy is on the right-hand side. The Topo Caparo sample contains 10.5 weight% siderite. And importantly, although we had suspected, based on mapping from orbit, that the magnesium sulfate unit would have contained abundant magnesium sulfates, here represented by kieserite and starkeyite, in fact, everyone on the mission, I believe, was surprised to find that it contained so much carbonate. And why were we surprised? Because in spite of detailed spectroscopic mapping from space, there was no indication that this particular sample and this particular set of strata would have contained carbonates. And largely, it's been shown since then by Rachel Shepard and colleagues that the reason for that is that it is masked in the orbital data. So, big surprise of the mission, these strata contain abundant iron carbonate, siderite. Going further up section to the Ubajara sample, we were able to again identify a location. This time we had transitioned into aeolian sediments, sediments that were deposited by wind-blown sediments in Gale crater. So this is again an image of the drill site. The drill site unfortunately is in shadow in this image, but you can see again, if you look at the detailed stratigraphy here, that these are aeolian sediments. Drilling into this sediment, we found that siderite is also abundant at Ubajara, so on the order of 4.8 weight% siderite in Ubajara. But importantly, unlike Topocaparo, it contains other minerals that are not that don't contain iron in their reduced state, but rather oxidized state. And this includes the minerals hematite and goethite. So these are these orangish, reddish minerals here. So importantly, this sample does also contain siderite, and it contains oxidized iron minerals, hematite and goethite. And those two features cannot form from the same fluid because the fluid must be fairly reducing to make iron carbonate. It must be fairly oxidizing to make hematite and goethite. So final sample that I'm going to talk about today, although this now is a couple of years ago and we've drilled several samples since, the final sample that is in the paper is the Sequoia sample. So Sequoia, again, was drilled in aeolian sediments, looks similar in its context to that sample that we drilled down below in the Ubajara area, but in this case, we're a little bit higher up. And now this sample is somewhere in between 7.6 weight% siderite, and again, it contains iron oxyhydroxides. This time it contains the mineral hematite and actiniite. So it contains another interesting iron oxidized iron mineral in addition to the siderite. So take-home point from these samples after Topocaparo and including Canaima before Topocaparo is that if we have a solution that's going to make magnesium sulfates and iron carbonates, that can be one solution, but you can't also make iron oxyhydroxides from that same solution because the redox state of the fluid has to be very different. And if that's the case, we must have two different phases of fluids, infiltration events. So now we have confirmation of siderite over 89 meters of stratigraphy from the ChemIn instrument, but obviously we weren't able to drill every single meter along the traverse because we usually only use the ChemIn instrument and drilling instrument a handful of times a year. So in order to get information on what we do between, or what the minerals are between these drill samples, we can rely on the ChemCam instrument. So this is a video reconstruction or animation of the ChemCam instrument analyzing sediments on the surface of Mars using its laser. What happens with the laser is it vaporizes the materials, turns them into a plasma, takes a picture of the plasma, and based on that tells us what its chemistry is. And so this image that I've been showing the whole time, along the traverse, each one of these dots is a place where we stopped, used the ChemCam instrument to get chemistry, and then continued on the traverse. And what you can see is that this difference from median, so this is using the bulk chemistry of the sample and calculating how different each point is from the median. What you see is that except for this area right here at the Amapari marker band, which again, we couldn't drill with the X-ray diffraction, or we couldn't drill with the Curiosity's drill anyways, that most of them plot near the very low numbers here in the single digits. And what that indicates is that we have fairly homogeneous chemistry throughout all of the distance between each of these individual drill samples. And in turn, we can interpret that to say the rocks are made out of the same thing in terms of their geochemistry, but obviously from details on the ground from the ChemIn instrument that they're not necessarily composed of the same thing in terms of the mineralogy. Okay, so before we get into that, how did the siderite form? Before we get into destroying it, how did it get into forming? So siderite formation requires reducing conditions. I already mentioned that earlier. And importantly, reducing here means really, really low fugacities of oxygen. So siderite forms below about 10 to the minus 60 bars of CO2 here and at 25 degrees. And what that means is that we have, from this Wordsworth paper that I showed earlier, we have a fairly robust understanding of oscillating redox in ancient Mars history. But what this means is that the siderite either formed out of contact with the atmosphere in a very reducing environment, or at a time during Mars's history whenever the atmosphere was reducing. So one of these blue bars relative to one of these red bars. Okay, importantly, the siderite is also extremely pure. So again, using the Rietveld refinement techniques that the Chemin team employs, we are able to get at the cell parameters. So this being exemplified here by the cell volume. So the unit cell volume of individual lattices in the siderite crystal structure. If we look at that, we could see these tie lines between pure iron carbonate. So XFE here representing pure or 100% iron carbonate, and 0 down here representing magnesium carbonate, manganese carbonate, or calcium carbonate. And there's our 3 samples, Ubajara, Tapacaparo, and Sequoia. They all plot effectively directly on top of the iron carbonate in terms of their cell volume. What that means is we can use regressions to calculate their chemistry, and we end up with formulas on the order of Fe97, Fe 95, and FeCO3. So almost entirely pure iron carbonate. So the observed siderite is uniquely pure relative to those other carbonates that have been observed on Mars. So this is the Comanche outcrop analyzed by one of the MER rovers, Allen Hills meteorite, Nakla meteorite, Governor de Valadares, and Lafayette meteorites all have significant amounts of magnesium, calcium, and iron in their structures. And these siderites that we've plotted here all plot extremely close to the 100% siderite. And remember, Jezero carbonates, although they're not included in this plot because we didn't yet have quantitative information when we submitted this manuscript, they are also magnesium rich. They're not pure in iron carbonate like this is. Importantly, the lack of manganese and calcium in the mineral structure suggests the precipitating fluid contained little of either. So that's shown here. These are some experimental data from Ritwika Sengupta from the University of Oxford from a number of years ago. And what her data show in compilation with others from the literature is that if there's basically any manganese whatsoever in the fluid or substantial calcium in the fluid, that partitions strongly into iron carbonate. Magnesium, not so much, especially at low temperature. At higher temperature, magnesium does strongly partition into the siderite structure. Together, what this means is that the solution contained little manganese and calcium, and it could have contained magnesium, but in any case, it must have precipitated at fairly low temperature, probably 25 degrees Celsius or below. Okay, building on that, experiments suggest that sedimentary siderite precipitation requires a high alkalinity or a low partial pressure of CO2. These are experimental data from a paper that I co-authored with Nick Tosca from a number of years ago. And what you see is that on the y-axis is the partial pressure or fugacity of CO2. And then these 2 lines here are the solubility of siderite mineral and the solubility of iron carbonate in terms of its critical supersaturation. So you basically need to be to the right of this red line in order to begin precipitating iron carbonate, even though its solubility is much lower. This is sort of a kinetic effect in order to precipitate siderite. And these experiments back that up. So anyone with a red dot here formed iron carbonate. The blue stuff was green rust, and then the white stuff being no precipitate at all. Okay, so I've taken those same lines and I've plotted them now in white on this plot. What this is able to show us is that we need high atmospheric PaCO2 in order to sustain liquid water. So these are the same data from earlier. So the minimum for collision-induced absorption warming and the minimum for high-altitude water ice cloud warming are both here on the y-axis. And again, you need on the order of half a bar or so of CO2 or significantly more in order to begin thinking about stabilizing liquid water. at those partial pressures of CO2, in order to overcome the critical supersaturation for siderite, we need substantial alkalinity in the fluid here. So this is a color map, and I'm sorry if that's not clear. But in the end, we need certainly tens or even hundreds of millimoles of alkalinity or milliequivalents of alkalinity to get there, something that is not particularly feasible in a basalt because basalts really like to consume rather than generate and eat or generate alkalinity. Okay, so importantly, it is easy enough in basaltic materials to get to lower partial pressures of CO2. So as waters infiltrate from Earth's atmosphere into the subsurface in Iceland, so that's what this stuff is on the left-hand side here, as these solutions go from atmospheric PCO2 down into the subsurface of the aquifers in Iceland. So even though the relative concentration of CO2 in those samples is not changing much, probably not within the variability of the sampling. As that pH increases with constant CO2, we can see that the partial pressure of CO2 decreases dramatically. I'm happy to answer questions about this if you like. But basically, what is happening is that because the concentration is fixed, but the solubility is increasing, the partial pressure is decreasing in that fluid. So what this suggests is that fluids in the subsurface of basaltic or even ultramafic rocks, they have high PCO2 or high pH, low PCO2 because their pH is increasing through ion exchange reactions with the basalts. And again, this happens all the time. You can go to Iceland and see this. This is also a diagram from the Oman ophiolite in Oman. And what you see again is that the pH increases. You end up with potentially magnesium and dissolved inorganic carbon-rich fluids. If this was Mars and reducing, you'd also have iron in those fluids as well. Okay, so siderite's very insoluble at high pH, and alkalinity limits require that it's much easier to get high pH at low PCO2. So here again is the solubility of iron carbonate. As we increase the pH up towards 8, 9, 10, you can see that the solubility decreases by many orders of magnitude. And that's essentially saying the same thing as what these two straight lines say. And as you get to those high pHs, it is worth looking at what the measured partial pressure of CO2 is of basaltic groundwaters in Iceland. And so this is the calculated PCO2 from those waters in Iceland on the order of 10 to the minus 4 PCO2, which when compared against Earth's modern atmosphere is significantly lower. And again, you can imagine something similar happening in Earth or on Mars, whereas CO2-rich fluids infiltrate into the subsurface, the pH increases, but the PCO2 decreases. Okay, so pore spaces out of direct communication with the atmosphere can have very different PCO2 than the overlying atmosphere. So this is just a plot from Itai Halevi's study of the Allen Hills meteorite looking at carbonates. And what you see is there's some exchange between the solution and the pore space gases, and then that gas is slowly escaping into the overlying atmosphere. But the internal PCO2 and external PCO2 here are different from one another. Importantly, it's far easier to produce siderite in fluids out of equilibrium with respect to atmospheric PCO2. So we have, again, this evidence here from Icelandic groundwaters and the fact that you would need incredible amounts of alkalinity, unachievable amounts of alkalinity in order to actually make carbonates in these two scenarios with very high half a bar or bar PCO2. But coupling with that, we can use results from the SAM instrument. This paper published by David Burt in 2024 shows us that if we look at the isotopes of carbon and oxygen, in this particular case, we're looking at the isotopes of carbon of siderite, we can see quite easily that they are far, far out of equilibrium with the modern atmosphere, and the modern atmosphere is thought to be even isotopically heavier than the ancient atmosphere. What this means in general is that these samples, and these are the fractionations, these dashed lines here, expected, these samples could not have possibly formed out of a solution that was in equilibrium with respect to the atmosphere on ancient or modern Mars. So in both cases, this supports the idea that pore space precipitation out of equilibrium with the atmosphere in a fairly high pH, fairly alkaline solution could have given us the siderite we observe. And there's a lot of other minerals here. And importantly, we are in the magnesium sulfate bearing unit after all. And the presence of these calcium sulfates, so anhydrite gypsum, and magnesium sulfates, starkite and kieserite, indicate that evaporation was likely a contributor to the presence of these minerals and likely also siderite. So this is a concept known as chemical divides, originally pioneered by Hans Oyster and Hardy in the 1970s, more recently picked up in the case of Mars by Tosca and McCunnan in 2006, and then reproduced for our paper to try and explain this process that would have led to the precipitation of siderite. And so there's a lot going on here, and I just highlight a few important things so that we can all try and get on the same page. As you go from left to right across the page, we're decreasing the amount of alkalinity and increasing the amount of sulfate in the solution. So decreasing ratio of alkalinity to sulfate left to right. So the two end members here are, a solution that contains lots of alkalinity on the left-hand side and very little sulfate. And on the right-hand side, a solution that is basically an acid, sulfuric acid, contains lots of sulfuric acid, but very little alkalinity. And so as you can see, in all cases except D and E, these ones that have lots of sulfuric acid in the initial solution, the first mineral to precipitate as you evaporatively concentrate, so going from top to bottom down the page, first mineral to precipitate is abbreviated SD or siderite. So siderite would be the first mineral to precipitate in the evaporation of any of these waters except for those that are highly acidic. If that's the case, then we can interpret that our siderite could have formed by evaporation. And then if we look further down the page at other minerals that form along the pathways, we end up with other minerals. For example, in these cases, MgS is magnesite. And in some cases, we see minerals such as melanterite, Ml. And again, those would suggest the presence of iron-rich fluids long after siderite precipitation, something that we do not observe at Gale. So what we believe or what we interpret is that the pathway that is most parsimonious with the data as observed is we initially precipitate siderite, which then consumes nearly all of the alkalinity in the sample, but leaves behind consumes nearly all the alkalinity and the iron in the sample, but leaves behind calcium, magnesium, and sulfate. If the sulfate is greater than the calcium concentration, the first mineral that we precipitate is gypsum. Once we precipitate gypsum, calcium goes away, and then the final mineral that we can precipitate is epsomite in this case, or magnesium sulfate more generally, again consistent with the progression of authigenic minerals we see in our sample. Siderite, calcium sulfate, magnesium sulfate. Okay, so the collected evidence based on our studies of siderite and Gale crater suggests that the identified siderite is sedimentary, so that's based on the composition of the siderite itself, the fact that it is precipitating apparently in the pore space between materials that are derived from weathering of basalt. It formed from a solution with initially low calcium to magnesium ratio. We can say that based on the concentration of calcium in the siderite, which is effectively nil. Low partial pressure of CO2. We can say that based on the amount of alkalinity that's required to nucleate and grow siderite. It must have been reducing. We can say that based on the fact that the iron is in its reduced state in this siderite mineral structure, and that it had circumneutral to basic pH, because at very low pH, the siderite solubility is exponentially higher than a neutral pH, and we need, therefore, to be at fairly neutral pH to have enough iron and carbonate in solution to make iron carbonate. So that implies, again, low sulfate in the initial solution. As we keep going and continue to evaporate those solutions, it increases calcium, magnesium, and sulfate concentration, and ultimately forms calcium sulfate, minerals like gypsum or anhydrite, and magnesium sulfate, minerals like kieserite and starkite. So what does this mean for ancient Martian climate and this missing carbon? So this is a fairly old paper now by Grotzinger and Millikan, basically using orbital mapping to define facies around the planet. And again, all over the planet, including in Gale crater, but also elsewhere, we see this transition from sulfates to iron oxides above, and you can map the thickness of these sulfate-bearing units in these craters. If that's the case, the laterally continuous sulfate facies and or the rhythmite orbital facies, so those are both defined here in the Grotzinger and Millikan paper, it totals on the order of 2.5 times 10 to the 6 kilometers squared, or substantially more if you total their volume. If the siderite abundance continues throughout the whole 2.2 cubic kilometer or 2.2 million cubic kilometers of equivalent orbital phase sheets, these rocks would hold about 36 millibars of CO2 equivalent. So that's a lot. That's 6 times what the atmosphere contains today. And if that was released to the atmosphere, we would have enough pressure to stabilize liquid water, because at that point, no longer are we evaporatively cooling the planet, and we can actually stabilize liquid water. But the temperature, based on our climate models, would not be above freezing. So this gets us part of the way there, but not all the way there. And stay tuned for more details on what we're working on to try and sort that out. But importantly, to close this story here, iron oxyhydroxides and siderite could not have formed from the same fluid. Their presence suggests diagenetic destruction of siderite. So we can't make siderite and iron oxyhydroxides like hematite and goethite and actinium from the same fluid. And this is supported by SAM data that shows the presence of small amounts of iron sulfate in these samples. So again, iron being reacted with sulfate during diagenesis potentially can contribute to this formation. And so what that implies is that we had this ancient Martian carbon cycle that was partially imbalanced. So what happens is we form the sulfate, the calcium sulfate, sort of form the siderite, calcium sulfate, and magnesium sulfate. Through diagenesis, fluids infiltrate significantly later. And as those fluids infiltrate, they react with our pre-existing siderite. Doesn't necessarily completely destroy the siderite. We see samples that contain both siderite and oxyhydroxides. Produces some more CO2. That CO2 gets released back into the atmosphere, and then you can complete the cycle in the way that you, again, can reprecipitate that siderite. But ultimately, because there is no plate tectonics on Mars, this cycle is fairly inefficient at recycling carbon. So the carbon cycle on ancient Mars was active but unique compared to Earth. Sources of CO2 include magma degassing and carbonate dissolution, we've now shown during diagenesis. Sinks include escape to space and carbonate formation. Ultimately, carbonate formation could account for tens of millibars of CO2. But because there's no tectonics, there's no long-term carbon cycle. So likely Mars lost its habitability because it couldn't maintain high PCO2 in its atmosphere. Ultimately, though, these PCO2 changes alone are not sufficient to explain why the climate changed on Mars, although they do appear to be necessary. So at least part of it must be PCO2 changes, and then something else broader must be happening as well. So thanks for that. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions if you have them.
Great. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to just raise your hand, or if there's no one waiting, you can just go ahead and ask away. Guess you convinced everybody.
Or maybe we just talk too fast.
Okay, well, I guess if there are no questions, we will go ahead and conclude the seminar. Thank you, Ben, so much for giving us your time and presenting this talk today.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. This is great.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
I've heard you many times, and I always learn something new each time.
Awesome.